I was born on December the 31st, 1923. My mother was a small lady, and they were preparing her to give birth here. But she was so small that she couldn't produce. And so my daddy took her in a T-model Ford and covered her up good, and they took her to LaGrange to the hospital. I was born in the hospital on the last day of the year. My daddy was born here in Harris County, and he was born in a family of several brothers and a couple of sisters. The location of their farm was just west of Hamilton in the Blue Springs area, and it consisted of a large farm, a school, and a store. That was the beginnings of the Askew generation. My family had there was a car garage really in the backyard, and attached to that car garage was a milk shed. And when I was in school, my job was to go take the cow to the pasture. Daddy had a farm down on the edge of town, and I would take the cow to the pasture, and in the afternoon I'd have to go get the cow and bring her back to the garage shed so he could milk her. It was about I guess at least a half a mile, because that farm was at the edge of town, and we had to walk. How did I meet Marguerite was a miracle in itself. It had to be God's hand, because the the dentist that was practicing here, Dr. Penhaligon, died. And Dr. Penhaligon's wife knew of Marguerite's daddy, who was a dentist up in North Carolina. And she contacted Dr. Foster to see if he would be interested in coming down and taking over Penhaligon's practice. And of course, Marguerite was 16, and he brought her down here with him. They came around Christmas of 1940. My college roommate and I had already made arrangements to date sisters from Atlanta. But him and his new car was enough to make me call my roommate and tell him to excuse me from my date with the Atlanta girl, that I had a date with another girl down here. And so after that night, the next day I sort of realized, I believe I like that one. So from that day on, she was my date, my sweetheart. She was a senior in high school, and I was a freshman in college. So every weekend that I could come home, I would date her. But along comes the war, and my dad happened to be on the local draft board, But I did this on my own. Nobody told me, nobody suggested it. But I went ahead and volunteered for the Army. And was sworn in and at Cochran Field in Macon. I knew that it wouldn't be long before I would be drafted, or if I was not drafted, people would say, if my daddy had been on the draft board, I wouldn't have had to go either. So we decided that it was a good move that I made on my own. Nobody told me to do it. Even my daddy didn't tell me to do it. Well, we got married on September the 12th, 1942. We slipped off. We had told our parents we were going to stay in Atlanta. We both secured jobs up there in Atlanta. And we were going to stay up there that weekend because that week I was having to go back to school. But instead of going to the zoo, we slipped off and went to Lafayette, Alabama. When we got to Lafayette, Alabama, and that was on a bus. When we got to Lafayette, Alabama, it was on Saturday, so the courthouse was closed. But some good citizen over there saw us, and a young couple, and asked about it, and told us that he would call the judge, and the judge would be glad to come back to the courthouse. And she did. It was a woman judge. J.C. Grady was her name. But of course the courthouse was locked up, so she had to get the courthouse unlocked and took us into her chambers. Then Marguerite and I took our stand and got married on September the 12th, Saturday. Now, I always felt like that the Lord's hand was in it because of the circumstances, Dr. Penhaligon died and those other situations, that he had a hand in it, and we were, quote, predestined to meet and to love one another. And she lived with me for 65 years as my wife until she died in June the 1st, 2007. And I've been wishing I could have her back, but I can't get her back. And I often in my prayers say that, Lord, I know there was many a point in time between the time we left Atlanta and the time we got to Alabama to get married. There was plenty of time for you to stop it. And you didn't. For that first Thanksgiving, we walked from there to town and went to the Crystal, and we had crystals for Thanksgiving dinner. But we both enjoyed those crystals. And then we had to walk back home back to the trailer. The trailer was bought by Mother and Daddy, and called us to come home between, before Thanksgiving. And at that time, they told us that they would help us by getting a trailer, and they did. Bought that trailer. And so when I came home for Christmas, Mother had redecorated the trailer, upholstery and whatnot. And after Christmas, we took the trailer back to Macon. and set it up there. And so I went to Fort McPherson and was sworn in at that time, and hadn't been married but just from September the 12th till October the 1st. But that's the way it was. And I soon got notice from the government, don't register for the next quarter in school because you're going to be called to active service. And so I was told to report to Fort McPherson on April the 10th. And I reported at April the 10th. And the first weekend I was at Fort McPherson, Mom and Daddy and Marguerite came up to see me. So I made up my mind that I was going to get stationed right there at Fort McPherson because it was so close to home. And so I went to my sergeant and asked him if I could get assigned there at Fort McPherson. But he said, no, you're already scheduled to go out. And so I was told where to go to, railroad crossing station there, and so I reported there, and from there I didn't know where I was going. I tried to ask other soldiers, where are we going? Nobody would know because they wouldn't tell us. We went on from Memphis to Little Rock, Arkansas, to Camp Joseph T. Robinson, Arkansas. Of course, we were met at the train and were put on trucks to take us out to the camp, and we were delivered to, everybody was delivered to whatever cabin they were supposed to go to. We finally got a room to our own and stayed there until I got changed, told to come to Camp Blanding, Florida. I reported as ordered, and instead of me finishing my training, I got sent to the payroll office, and from there I stayed there until a later development. But I was, instead of finishing up my regular infantry training, I was doing payrolls. So I transferred to Camp Blanding, Florida. Got put back in payrolls, sitting at the long table with the other clerks, other PFCs. By that time I'd made T5, I think. But after Marguerite's daddy had died and left Marguerite his car, we took that car back down to St. Augustine. And the day the war ended, we were on the way back from Camp Blanding to St. Augustine, and we heard it on the radio. So by the time we got to St. Augustine, in the middle of town in St. Augustine was a slave market with streets on each side. So by the time we got to St. Augustine, we were blowing the horn, just living on the horn, and started a circle around that slave market. And before long, it was full of cars. Everybody going around that slave market with the horns blowing. And little Ellen was saying, ah! She was joining in too. I used to love to play basketball. I was always short, so I couldn't match up very well with the great big boys. But I had always dreamed about going to a national tournament. And after the war was over and us old GIs started back to college, we had a American Legion post on the campus. And we all decided, well, why don't we get a basketball team of the post? So we did. And this is us right here. And this is my pass to the tournament that was in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, March the 30th, 31st, and April 1 and 2 of 1949. So I got to play in a national basketball tournament anyway. 15 years later, Jeff was born, and then 4 years later, Sally was born. So those were the three children that God gave us, which indicated to me that He blessed our marriage. And I often in my prayers say that, Lord, I know there was many a point in time between the time we left Atlanta and the time we got to Alabama to get married. There was plenty of time for you to stop it. And you didn't. So I know it was in the books. And of course the three children have come along. I thank the Lord for my parents and their influence on my life. I thank the Lord that I was able to go to college and get a AB degree and then get a LLB degree on top of that, and then get a doctorate of law, PhD. So I was able to do all of that. I want to thank the Lord for all of that. And of course, the most I want to thank the Lord for is for my family, Marguerite and Ellen and Jeff and Sally, and for the fact that I've been able to make a living this long and that I have lived this long. I thank the Lord that I was able to practice law. I thank the Lord that I was appointed a judge. I'm 95 years old, just past 95, and looking forward for 96. I hope that with this number of years I have fulfilled my destiny, and I'm looking forward to what's beyond.